Let's dispel some common myths about profits and the effects of costs on prices. Real-world examples, such as the Canadian auto market, help illustrate these principles. The pass-through parameter measures the extent to which changes in costs are reflected in prices. In competitive markets, it's often assumed that any change in marginal cost should be fully passed through to consumers. However, this isn't always the case. The pass-through rate can be less than 1, especially if complementary factors, like labor, are subject to supply constraints. This means that not all cost increases are reflected in higher consumer prices. This is related to the myth is that imperfect pass-through indicates a lack of competition. In reality, even in competitive markets, the pass-through can be incomplete due to the interplay of different production factors. For instance, if labor is a complementary factor with supply constraints, the pass-through will be limited. Let's use the notation from Chapter 14 to illustrate the determinants of pass-through in a competitive market. K is perfectly elastically supplied. L is not. The elasticity of supply of Y, epsilon S, is finite, with a magnitude that depends on the supply conditions for both K and L. At low levels of demand, the industry's production is L-intensive because of its low marginal cost. That's what it means for the supply of L to slope up. At high levels of demand, industry production is K-intensive because, unlike the L market, the marginal cost of K does not rise with use. In a sense, K is the marginal production factor, while L is the inframarginal production factor. That characterization exaggerates somewhat because a bit of L is used at the margin even at high output levels, but it helps illustrate the results that follow because R potentially affects marginal costs more than average costs. To determine the reciprocal of epsilon S, we need to calculate how P is affected by Y on the supply side by moving along the two-factor supply curves. Because the supply of K is horizontal, the L part of the industry model is represented by these three equations. The last equation allows for the possibility that del Y affects del W by moving up L's supply curve, which has price elasticity epsilon SL. Altogether, there are three equations from which we want to eliminate delta LL. Then one equation remains. The coefficient on delta Y is the reciprocal of epsilon SL, which is strictly positive if K and L are not perfect substitutes and the supply of L slopes up. The bottom line is that the pass-through parameter theta for the output market could be much less than 1, especially if a complementary factor like L is subject to supply constraints. For the reasons suggested in Chapter 9, the complementary factor likely responds more in the long run than in the short run, which means that the long-run pass-through parameter might be closer to 1 than in the short run. Let's shock the average and marginal cost of the elastically supplied factor K. Denote the addition as delta R. At a given level of output, the effect on downstream marginal cost, that is, the marginal cost of Y, is Sk times delta R. The equilibrium effect is theta Sk delta R, reflecting both the direct effect of the cost shock and the indirect effect on marginal cost through the induced output change. With a pass-through parameter, theta, that is less than 1, the cost shock is not fully passed through to downstream consumers. Take the case of the Canadian auto market, where most new cars are imported. Changes in the Canadian exchange rate against the manufacturing countries appear to have little effect on Canadian dollar retail prices, even though marginal production costs move with the exchange rate. The low short-run pass-through rate is nevertheless consistent with competition to the extent that epsilon S is low. Especially, local dealerships are an integral part of new automobile sales and are not a good substitute for manufacturing. Expressed in the notation of Chapter 14, K denotes manufacturing inputs from outside Canada. L denotes local dealer inputs, and sigma is close to 0. The retail price, P, is combination of payments to dealers and manufacturers. Particularly when market participants perceive the exchange rate change to be short-lived, there may be little entry or exit of dealerships. With epsilon SL and thereby epsilon S close to zero in the short run, even the competitive model predicts little effect of the exchange rate on retail prices.